It was New Year's Eve night and the most exclusive restaurant in Madrid was packed with elegant people celebrating the arrival of the new year. Julia Fernandez, age 42, CEO of one of Spain's largest tech companies. She walked in alone in her red silk dress and her €15,000 Hermes bag. She had booked the table 2 months prior, but when she approached the maitre d', he told her with an awkward smile that there had been a mistake and her table had been given to someone else. She looked at the crowded dining room, feeling everyone's eyes on her, feeling the shame rise like a wave. She was one of the most powerful women in Spain. She managed a €2 billion empire, but in that moment she felt more alone and smaller than ever. She was about to turn around and leave with tears stinging her eyes when a man at the back of the room stood up. He wore a work shirt stained with grease. He had the hands of someone who worked with engines, and next to him was a little girl in a purple dress. The man raised his hand and signaled to her, inviting her to sit at his table. Julia Fernandez was born into a family of Madrid business owners who had built their fortune in the textile sector during the economic boom of the 1960s. Her father, Roberto Fernandez, was a severe man who believed success was the only measure of a person's worth. Her mother, Elena, was an elegant but distant woman, more concerned with social appearances than affection for her children. Julia had grown up in a mansion in La Moraleja, surrounded by luxury, but starved for affection. She had learned early that to earn her father's attention, she had to excel at everything. Top grades in school, an honors degree from USAID, a master's from Harvard. Every achievement was an attempt to feel worthy of love, but the love never came. At 25, she entered the family business as an intern, refusing any special treatment. At 30, she was director of operations. At 35, when her father died suddenly of a heart attack, she took the reins of the company and transformed it from a declining textile firm into a tech colossus that produced components for the world's largest automotive companies. At 42, Julia Fernandez was on the cover of Forbes Spain. She was invited to international economic summits, courted by politicians and businessmen. But when she returned home at night, to her 200-square-meter penthouse overlooking the Castellana, only silence greeted her. She'd had relationships, of course, men attracted to her power, her money, the prestige of being seen at her side. But none who looked her in the eyes and saw the woman behind the success. The last one, Marcos, a successful lawyer, had left her 3 months prior. Only later did she discover he had been cheating on her with a younger woman, one who didn't work 70 hours a week. Her mother had died the year before, and with her died the last hope of ever having a real family. She had no siblings, no children, no one waiting for her at home for the holidays. That New Year's Eve, Julia had looked at herself in the mirror in her red dress and wondered what she was celebrating. Another year of professional successes that meant nothing. She had booked a table at the Salagain restaurant because she couldn't bear the thought of staying home alone watching the countdown. But fate had other plans for her that night. Alejandro Ruiz was 38, with calloused hands and a heart as big as the sky over Seville, the city where he was born and raised among the scent of orange blossoms and the sound of flamenco guitars. He was the son of a bricklayer and a woman who cleaned houses in the wealthy neighborhoods of Triana. He hadn't finished high school. At 16, his father died in a construction accident and Alejandro had to leave school to help his mother support his younger siblings. He had worked in a neighborhood mechanic shop, discovering he had a natural talent for engines. At 20, he moved to Madrid, drawn by the opportunities the capital promised. He had worked as an employee in several shops, always the first to arrive and the last to leave. At 28, he opened his own shop, a small place in Vallecas that he bought with a lifetime of savings and a loan that took 10 years to pay off. The shop hadn't made him rich, but it had given him something more valuable than money, the dignity of being master of his own destiny. His customers respected him for his honesty and the quality of his work. At 30, he met Clara, a primary school teacher with the sweetest smile he had ever seen. They met because she brought her old CD Ibiza to the shop, and he fell in love with her while explaining what was wrong with the engine. They had been happy, deeply and simply happy. In their 60-square-meter apartment, they had a daughter, Sophia, who inherited her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness. For 5 years, Alejandro believed he had everything a man could want. Then Clara got sick. The cancer came silently and mercilessly. In 18 months, it took the woman Alejandro loved, leaving him alone with a 6-year-old girl who asked every night when mommy was coming back. 2 years had passed since then. 2 years in which Alejandro had learned to be both father and mother, to cook, to comb Sophia's hair, to comfort her when she cried in her sleep. 2 years in which he buried his own pain to be strong for his daughter. That New Year's Eve, Alejandro had decided to do something special for Sophia. He took her to the Sala Gain restaurant, spending in one night what he normally earned in a week. He wanted her to have a happy memory. He didn't expect that night would change his life forever. When Julia entered the restaurant, Alejandro noticed her immediately, not just because she was beautiful, though she was, with that red dress that seemed painted onto her elegant figure and that bearing of someone accustomed to the world opening up before her. He noticed her because he recognized something in her eyes, something he saw every morning when he looked in the bathroom mirror before going to the shop. It was loneliness, that particular loneliness of someone surrounded by people but with no one truly by their side, someone who smiles for photos but cries in silence when no one is looking. He saw the scene at the maitre d' stand. He saw the way the man in the tuxedo shook his head with false regret while consulting a list he clearly didn't need to consult. He saw the woman in red stiffen as if she'd been struck. He saw the mask of control she tried to maintain while her world collapsed over something as seemingly trivial as a restaurant table. But Alejandro knew it wasn't trivial. He knew what it meant to feel rejected, invisible, not good enough for anyone, to feel the world slamming doors in your face when you most needed someone to open them. Sophia tugged insistently on her father's sleeve and asked who that lady was with the dress so pretty it looked like it was from a princess story. Alejandro told her he didn't know, but that she seemed very sad, as if something bad had happened to her. Sophia, with the innocent wisdom of children who haven't yet learned to build walls or judge by appearances, said that then they had to invite her to sit with them, because no one should be sad on New Year's Eve, especially not such a pretty lady with such a beautiful dress. Alejandro hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of reality on his shoulders. He knew this woman belonged to a world completely different from his, a world of wealth and power and privilege he would never know. A world where people like him were invisible, or worse, an object of ridicule and contempt. He knew she would probably look at him with disdain or condescending pity, that she would reject his invitation with a cold, polite smile that would hurt more than any direct insult. But then he looked at his daughter, saw the absolute sincerity on her freckled face and in her eyes that still believed in the goodness of the world, and remembered what Clara always told him when he doubted himself. That kindness costs nothing and can change everything in a person's life, that sometimes a small gesture of generosity can be the difference between despair and hope. He slowly stood up, feeling the eyes of the entire restaurant fixed on him like icicles. He was painfully aware of his grease-stained shirt, which he hadn't managed to clean completely, his calloused hands with nails blackened from work, the fact that he looked completely out of place in this temple of Madrid luxury, where a bottle of wine cost more than he earned in an entire day of work. But he stood up anyway because his daughter had taught him something he had forgotten, that being a good person was more important than fitting in anywhere. He raised his hand and signaled to the woman in red who was about to leave, inviting her over with a gesture he hoped didn't seem too clumsy or too bold. Julia saw him and stopped short, her heart pounding against her ribs. For a moment she thought she had misunderstood, that the gesture was meant for someone more appropriate behind her, someone who belonged in that world of white tablecloths and crystal glasses. But the man kept looking directly into her eyes with a simple, unpretentious smile she hadn't seen in years, pointing to the empty chair at his table as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The maitre d' approached her with an uncomfortable, almost scandalized expression, trying to dissuade her from what she was clearly thinking of doing. He whispered that he would find a solution in a few minutes, that he was making calls, that it was absolutely not necessary for her to sit with that sort of people, uttering the last words with barely concealed contempt that ignited something inside Julia. Julia looked at him with an expression that had made CEOs and government ministers tremble in the most important boardrooms in the country, and told him in a clear, firm voice that that sort of people was exactly who she wanted to spend New Year's Eve with, and that if he had a problem with that, he could find another job. She walked through the restaurant with determined steps, feeling every eye fixed on her as if she were an exotic animal in a zoo. She heard the whispers as she passed. She saw the incredulous expressions of the diners, who recognized her from magazines and television, the raised eyebrows and mouths open in surprise. Julia Fernandez, the queen of Spanish industry, the woman from Forbes, going to sit with a neighborhood mechanic with a stained shirt and his little daughter. But for the first time in years, she didn't care at all what anyone else thought. What mattered to her was the genuine smile of the man who had stood up for her when no one else had, and the curious, bright gaze of the little girl watching her approach with the excitement of someone about to meet a storybook character. Alejandro introduced himself with a firm, honest handshake, the kind Julia hadn't received in years, accustomed as she was to the calculated, strategic touches of the business world, where everything was appearance and manipulation. He told her his name and his daughter's with naturalness, without nervousness or pretension, and asked her if she wanted red or white wine. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask what she did. He didn't try to impress her or figure out if he could gain something from knowing her. He treated her simply as a person who needed a place to sit, as a human being entitled to a little kindness on a difficult night. Sophia was the one who definitively broke the ice with the frankness typical of children who haven't yet learned to measure their words or calculate their effects. She told Julia that her dress was the most beautiful she had ever seen in her whole life, even prettier than the dresses of the princesses in Disney movies. And she asked with bright eyes if she was a real princess who had come from a faraway castle. Julia felt something melt inside her, something that had been frozen for too long, something she had forgotten existed beneath all the layers of professional armor she had built over the years. She laughed, a real laugh that bubbled up from some deep place she hadn't visited in years, and told her she wasn't a princess, just a woman who worked too much and had completely forgotten how to have fun and enjoy the simple things in life. Dinner unfolded in a way Julia couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. Alejandro told her about his shop in Vallecas, about the cars he repaired with his own hands, about the customers who had become friends over the years because he always treated them with honesty and respect, about the small satisfactions of fixing something that seemed irreparable and seeing the owner's relieved face when the engine purred like new again. He spoke of Seville, of his poor but extraordinarily happy childhood in the narrow streets of the Triana neighborhood, where everyone knew each other and doors were always open for neighbors. He told her of the scent of orange blossoms that flooded the streets in spring, which he still missed every year even after 2 decades in Madrid, of the sound of clapping and guitars that accompanied summer nights and had taught him that happiness had nothing to do with money. He spoke of Clara with a sweetness in his voice that made Julia's eyes fill with tears. He told her how they had met at the shop, how she had arrived in her beat-up seat, and he had fallen for her smile before even knowing her name, how she had made him a better man simply by believing in him when no one else did. He told her how he was trying to be both father and mother to Sophia, how every day was a new challenge he faced without an instruction manual, how he sometimes felt completely inadequate and lost, but kept going because his daughter deserved the best he could give her, even if the best he could give was simply being present and loving her with all his heart. Sophia showed her the drawings she had made at school. Drawings full of bright colors, with a huge sun and a figure with wings that, she explained matter-of-factly, was her mom, watching from heaven. She told her about her imaginary cat named Principe, who protected her from monsters under the bed and from nightmares that sometimes came at night. She asked with genuine curiosity if Julia also had a pet or an imaginary friend. Julia found herself telling her about the dog she had as a child, a cinnamon-colored cocker spaniel named Canela. The only real friend of her lonely childhood in that mansion too big and too quiet, where her parents were always busy and affection was as scarce a commodity as water in the desert. For the first time in years, Julia didn't think about work, about the next day's meetings, about company problems, about the emails piling up in her inbox demanding urgent answers and decisions that affected thousands of employees. For the first time in years, she was simply present, completely present in that moment, at that table, with those two people who wanted absolutely nothing from her except her company, who didn't judge her by her title, her wealth, or her position in the business world. When midnight arrived, the restaurant erupted in applause and toasts as the television showed the countdown from the Puerta del Sol and people prepared to eat the 12 grapes. The waiters brought the grapes and champagne with professional efficiency. Fireworks lit up the Madrid sky outside the windows, with explosions of color reflected in the restaurant's gilded walls and in Sofia's awestruck eyes. Alejandro raised his glass with solemnity and gave a simple but profound toast, to good people found by chance in the most unexpected places, and to the immense fortune of recognizing them when you find them. Julia clinked glasses with him, feeling that those simple words meant more than all the elaborate, empty speeches she had heard at galas throughout her career, more than all the hollow promises from politicians and businessmen who courted her for her money and influence. Sofia had fallen asleep in her chair before the countdown, tired but happy, her head resting on her father's jacket and a smile of peace still on her lips. Alejandro looked at her with a love so pure, so unconditional, so utterly devoid of calculation or self-interest, that Julia felt her heart contract in an almost painful way she hadn't experienced in decades. That was exactly what had been missing her whole life. Not the professional success she had obsessively pursued, not the money she had accumulated without quite knowing why, not the power she wielded over thousands of employees and millions in revenue. Love. The real kind, the kind that asks for nothing in return, the kind given freely and without conditions, the kind that lights up a gaze when looking at the one you love. They exchanged phone numbers with the excuse that Julia would want to take her car to Alejandro's shop for a full checkup. Both knew perfectly well it was just an excuse, a white lie. But neither said it out loud, because sometimes kind lies are the way the most beautiful stories begin, the stories that change lives forever. In the weeks that followed, Julia found 1,000 excuses to see Alejandro. She took her Mercedes to the shop for a checkup it didn't need. She picked up Sofia after school. She invited them both to dinner at her penthouse, cooking for the first time in years. Alejandro, for his part, wrestled with his own doubts. He knew who Julia was. He had looked up her name online. He wondered what a woman like that could want with a simple mechanic with grease-stained hands. But then he saw her playing with Sofia, laughing at his jokes, taking a genuine interest in his life, and the doubts faded. Julia didn't behave like the wealthy people he had met. She looked him in the eye, listened when he spoke, treated him as an equal. The first kiss came one Saturday afternoon in the deserted shop after closing time. Julia had stopped by with the excuse of a strange noise in the engine. They had laughed together, both getting stained with grease. And then they had looked at each other and the world stopped. Alejandro had kissed her carefully, and Julia had felt something she hadn't felt in so long she had almost forgotten what it was. But not everyone was happy with their relationship. Julia's friends didn't approve. A woman of her station with a mechanic from Vallecas? Some business partners hinted that the relationship could affect business. Julia sent them all packing. She said her private life was her own business, and if anyone had a problem with her personal choices, they could find another company to invest in. Alejandro faced his own challenges. His brother asked him if he was sure about what he was doing, if he wasn't afraid of being just a pastime for a bored woman. But Alejandro knew Julia by now. He knew what was between them was real, and he knew that real love required courage. 1 year after that New Year's Eve night, Julia and Alejandro got married, not in a cathedral with 1,000 guests, not in a €100,000 dress. They got married in the courtyard of Alejandro's shop, decorated with flowers and fairy lights by Sofia. Julia wore a simple white dress. Alejandro wore a suit he had bought for the occasion, the first elegant suit of his life. Sofia was the maid of honor, so proud and happy she seemed to shine brighter than the fairy lights. Only the people who truly mattered were there: Alejandro's mother, who came from Seville, some old friends of Julia's, the real ones, loyal customers from the shop. There were no journalists, no cameras, and Julia had never been happier. During the party, Alejandro gave a speech no one would forget. He told the story of that New Year's Eve, how he had seen a beautiful woman with the saddest eyes he had ever seen. He told how his daughter had told him to invite her, because no one should be sad on New Year's Eve. He said what had started as a gesture of kindness had transformed into the greatest gift of his life. Julia cried, and she didn't care that her makeup was ruined. She cried because she had finally found what she had been searching for her whole life, a good man, an honest man, a man who loved her for who she was. Today, 3 years after that wedding, Julia's life is unrecognizable. She has stepped back from the day-to-day management of the company. She started a foundation that helps young people from humble neighborhoods learn a trade, inspired by Alejandro's story. Alejandro still runs his shop. He didn't want to expand too much. Julia sometimes helps him by passing tools. She's become very good at changing tires. Sophia is 11 now and has a 2-year-old little sister named Clara, after the mother who is no longer here. When asked about her family, Sophia proudly says her dad fixes cars and her mom Julia used to be a sad princess, but then she found them and now she's the happiest princess in the world. Every New Year's Eve, the family returns to the Gain restaurant. They go back because that's where it all started, where a mechanic with a stained shirt stood up and signaled to a lonely billionaire. The maitre d', the one who that night tried to convince Julia not to sit with that sort of people, is still there. Every year he greets them with an awkward smile, and every year Julia leaves him a generous tip, to remind him that people aren't judged by the clothes they wear. Because what that New Year's Eve taught Julia is that true wealth isn't measured in euros. It's measured in the people who love you, in the moments you share, in the courage to stand up and signal to someone who needs a place to sit. This story reminds us that loneliness knows no social class. Julia had everything money could buy, and yet she lacked the only thing that matters, someone who saw her for who she was. Alejandro had no riches, but he had a generous heart and the courage to act on his principles. Sophia teaches us that wisdom comes from the little ones. It was she who said no one should be sad on New Year's Eve. She who convinced her father to make that gesture that changed 3 lives. Alejandro's gesture reminds us that kindness can change destiny. He didn't know who Julia was. He wasn't seeking anything in return. He simply saw a person in difficulty and decided to do something. And Julia demonstrates that it's never too late to change your life, to choose happiness over success, to put people before work. If this story has reminded you that love is found in the most unexpected places, that kindness is the true wealth that never depreciates, and that we should never judge people by appearances or the clothes they wear, then it has served its purpose in this world. Thank you for traveling with me to the end of this story.